Thank you very much. The last time I talked for Darwin Days was 4 years ago, and I did talk about Darwin and evolution. I teach a human evolution course on campus. I have a PhD from my ecology and evolutionary biology department, but I'm really a bioarchaeologist, and so I think it's a misnomer to think that human evolution stopped when we became anatomically modern as early as 200,000 years ago. So I study recent human evolution, which means ancient but anatomically modern humans from Central Asia, North Central Asia. Specifically, most of my work has been in the Lake Baikal region of Siberia, where I work with remains anywhere from about 4,000 to about 8,000 years old. So if you're a young earther, obviously that doesn't work with your picture of the world, but for the rest of us, it fits very nicely, all within the Middle Holocene, essentially. So as Kendra said, I'm going to talk about 3 different cases today involving 14 different individuals. They're all a little bit sad. Nothing is gory, but if you're particularly sensitive, just be forewarned that there's no way you could die in the past and me see it without it being a little bit sad. So just be forewarned that it's not a fun topic, but it's a really interesting topic, and I don't take it lightly. I'm very respectful, but the science and the information we can get from these individuals is really, really interesting and really relevant for what I do for my discipline. So I hope that this isn't upsetting to anybody. This will be the ugliest picture you see. So they're just skeletons. There's nothing that horrific. My kids are so used to this that it doesn't faze them at all. So I hope that nobody's upset. So so you know what I do, bioarchaeology is the study of human remains from archaeological contexts. So that could be anywhere from 100,000 years ago to 100 years ago. And as I said, I work sort of in that 4,000 to 8,000 year period. Now, most diseases and pathological conditions that people suffer from in life never manifest themselves on the skeleton. That means we can't see them. In fact, in ancient time, most people died from acute diseases, things like the flu and gastrointestinal infections, and none of that would have been evident on the skeleton. So for the vast majority of the skeletons I look at, well, I can tell you all kinds of things about how they lived and how active they were and what they ate. I almost can never tell you how they died because very few conditions will actually show up on the skeleton. There's a few cases where that's the case. If somebody suffered from a long-standing chronic condition, I can see evidence of that. If somebody was beaten to death, I can see evidence of that. But most of the time, I can't tell you how they died. And that's a bit of a problem because then we can only see part of the picture and not the whole picture. So today I'm going to tell you about 3 different cases, 14 different individuals where I can tell you how they died. And they're really I think they're really quite remarkable cases. One of them, and I apologize, was in the news insanely this week. I did not plan that. So if you've already heard the news story, then just bear with me. But hopefully I give you a little bit more than the news people gave you. And I was misquoted, by the way, sometimes. So hopefully I give you the correct story. So this is the area of the world where I work. Lake Baikal, right here, just north of Mongolia in southern Siberia, which is in Russia, is the biggest lake in the world, the deepest lake in the world, millions of years old. It's cool for all kinds of reasons. If you're a biology person especially, you probably know that. And the area I work is north, that's Lake Baikal right there, north and west of the lake. We call it the Cis Baikal. And these are just the time periods, early Neolithic, between 8,000 and 6,800 years ago, all the way down to the early Bronze Age, between 5,200 and 4,000 years ago. I'm part of a much bigger project that is asking all kinds of complex questions that I won't bore you with. But one of those questions relates to this period in the Middle Neolithic where we don't have any cemeteries. In the other 2 periods, we have cemeteries, and then we don't, and then we do again. And people are different on either side of that hiatus. So it's an interesting archaeological question that I won't bore you with now, but maybe another time. So I'm just going to tell you about 3 cool cases. One of them dates to this period. This is the woman with twins story that's been in the news. And 2 of them date from that later period called the early Bronze Age. This is just a picture of Lake Baikal that I took this past summer because it's beautiful. This is the famous Shaman's Cave. It's called Shaminsky Mis. It's a very sacred site for the local Buryat people. But just to give you a sense of the landscape. It's actually about the same latitude as us here in Saskatoon. So nasty cold winters, short, nice summers. Really similar, dry sort of steppe forest area. The first case I want to talk about is a massacre at the site of Shamanka II which is located, there we go, see that's as exciting as my animation gets, right at the southern tip of the lake, right here. And this is a cemetery that is an early Neolithic cemetery, so it dates between about 7,000 and 8,000 years ago, but the massacre does not date to that period. So what we have, Saskatchewan, this cemetery that's an early Neolithic cemetery, has 166 individuals that have been excavated since 2000. It's completely excavated now, so it's a very large cemetery. Of those 166 individuals, 10 of them are in the wrong time period. 10 of them are about 3,000 years more recent, dating to the early Bronze Age. And most of those 10 individuals have evidence of violent, traumatic death. So they're really unusual. One, they're buried in the wrong cemetery, or they're essentially intrusive graves in an earlier time period cemetery. And two, almost all of them suffered from violence that caused their death. And I'll show you lots of images of those. They're not gross, but they are a little bit disturbing. Of those early Neolithic folks, we've got some of them in double or triple burials, most of them buried by themselves, lots of different interesting grave goods. But from the individuals that suffered from the massacre, they're all in single pits except for one case, and really rich grave goods. And as I said, lots and lots of evidence of violence. This is just a site plan of the site, and you can see it's on the edge of the lake there. And there are two different clusters that I have in red of those early Neolithic. So those are the later period, I'm sorry, early Bronze Age, the later period intrusive burials that are in an otherwise much earlier cemetery. So the ones in red, those two clusters, one in the north and one in the south, are about 3,000 years later than the rest of the burials, buried over top of them and sometimes cutting through those earlier graves. That's really, really unusual. So we've got a north cluster and a south cluster. In the south cluster, 4 graves, very rich grave goods, lots of bronze. I'll show you some pictures of the skeletons, and you can see they're just scattered sometimes with hundreds of different artifacts. All of them are young adult or adolescent males. That's interesting. If you think about violence, you generally think that males are involved in violence more likely than females, and that's not me being sexist. The stats show that, and we see it 3,000 years ago too, 4,000 years ago. So most of them are males. In the southern cluster, all of them are males and young males. That cluster had particularly rich grave goods and stone cairns over top, so essentially piles of stones marking the graves when they were buried. The north cluster is at the top of the hill, 5 graves with 6 individuals. Most of those are males, but we don't have only males. We also have a middle sort of adult woman, a brand new baby, a neonate, a child, and an adolescent that I couldn't tell the sex of. And of those, the 2 males are absolutely beaten to death. I call it overkill because you just don't have to put 8 arrows into a body. So really, really interesting. Those grave goods are not quite as rich. There's very little bronze, and they didn't have those big, massive stone cairns over the graves. So already the fact that they're clustered together, but they're different, suggests that they might represent two different events, essentially. Not one, perhaps, massacre, but in fact 2. So I'm just gonna, this is the only individual I don't have pictures for, sorry. This was in the southern cluster, 4 young males, all with evidence of violence, and this one had a projectile wound. A projectile is just a fancy word for an arrowhead embedded in his neck, in the back of his neck. And I don't have a picture of that, but I'm working with my Russian colleagues to get one. The second individual burial, 3, also a young male, and he had 3 arrowhead wounds. 1 in the middle of his back, I don't have a picture of that. 1 in his pubic bone on the front right here. Keeping this PG-13, I won't explain exactly where that is, but you can probably figure it out. It's in the front of your pelvis, and you can see there's an incision there. The arrowhead itself is no longer in the bone, but you can see the mark really clearly. And then this is the front part of his elbow on the left side, and you can actually see, well, I'm not sure, my picture taking skills aren't that good, but there's actually the tip of the point embedded there. So 3 arrowhead wounds, all of them occurring at or around the time of death, because there's no evidence of healing. The third individual, burial 5, also a young male between 19 and 22 years old. Here he is in his grave pit. There's a little bit of disturbance, but mostly the body's nicely laid out. And again, you can see in the back of his cranium, there's the distinct mark of an arrowhead puncture wound. My colleague from Oxford is not convinced that this would have caused death, because this is quite low on the head through those thick neck muscles at the back of the head. So it's possible that this didn't kill him, but it happened at or around the time of death with no sign of healing. So there may have been, in fact, almost certainly were other wounds that just didn't happen to affect the skeleton. If you think about shooting arrows into a body, you might not hit bone all the time, and if you don't hit bone, then I won't see it. You can see in the grave there's lots of artifacts, including arrowheads, and it's almost impossible sometimes to tell if those were weapons that were in his body or if they were buried with him by his loved ones. So this one almost certainly died violently as well. And the fourth of those individuals in the southern cluster, the rich cluster, also a young, late adolescent male, and not only an arrowhead wound right here, this is in the lower part of the back, entering from the front, you can see the wound right here in the photo actually, but also cranial trauma. Somebody bashed him on the head and fractured his skull. So all of those things, again, right around the time of death, suggesting that these four young men died violently and were buried very specifically in a cemetery that was otherwise not their cemetery. This isn't a normal attritional assemblage that when our people die, we put them there, because we only have young men in this particular cluster and they all died violently, so that's really unusual. In the north cluster, we have one child between the ages of 5 and 6 that has some evidence of trauma. And that child was buried, here he is right here, or she, I don't know the sex, was buried with an older adolescent child between 14 and 16. I couldn't tell the sex of that one as well. There was no evidence of violence on the older child, but that doesn't mean there wasn't violence. As I said, just because I don't see it on the skeleton doesn't mean it wasn't there. And then a third grave here with the body of a newborn baby. And there's no evidence of violence on a newborn baby, but you can imagine those very easy to snuff up the life of a newborn baby without leaving evidence of it. So those ones, certainly one of them and possibly the others all died violently, but they're all very standard in the cluster. In that north cluster as well, we've got a couple of other individuals, all with evidence of violence. Here is a male between the ages of 20 and 23, and this one is without a doubt a case of overkill. You don't have to beat somebody that much if you want him to die. What we have is extensive fracture into the cranium, at least 4 different blows, and you can see the points of impact here, including chop marks on the mandible. Now what's interesting about this is these chop marks don't look like they were made by stone tools, which is what these people had. Their technology is stone tools, arrows, ground stone adzes, things like that. These chop marks look specifically like they were made by metal weapons, and these people did not have metal weapons. So this is a bit of a mystery for us. You can see the chop marks on the mandible and the blows on the cranium. In addition to that, there are 3 arrowhead injuries on this person, same person's body as well. And I've marked them on the image, and then you can see the images. So one in the left rib, one in the left shoulder blade or scapula, and one in the middle of the back. And you can see that arrow right there. It wasn't even pulled out. Can you all see that? Mm-hmm. So it's in perfect shape. The other ones are tips or little nicks. Sometimes the arrows go right through. Yeah?
Are these arrows metal or?
No, stones. They're all stone. They did have metal, but they only had bronze, and they used it for decorative purposes. So sometimes you'd see rings or small brass pendants or bronze pendants, but they didn't have metal weapons or metal tools. So all of the weapons and tools were made out of stone, chipped stone or brown stone. So these arrowheads are really beautiful, very small, and all made out of flint or chert or something like that. This individual was blown female, between 40 and 50 years old. When I was much younger, I'd probably call her an older female, but now I don't think that's so old, so we'll say middle adult female. And she's got 2 lesions on her body that suggest violence. One is this sort of cut mark or almost like a chop mark on the bottom of her cheek on the right side there, and here's another image of it. And the other one is at the base of her, the first knuckle on her thumb, where again, it's a chop mark that would have happened during life, because you can tell the way the bone breaks, but there's no evidence of healing. So again, suggesting perhaps defensive moves. If somebody's coming at you, you generally put your hands out to protect yourself. So that may have been a defensive wound on her hand and a chop mark to her cheek. So probably she died violently as well. No evidence of healing. And then the last guy in the north cluster is the worst of all in terms of overkill. Again, a young male between 18 and 20 years. And we've got evidence of 2 or 3 blows to the head, including a remarkable chop mark right here on the right side of the mandible. This is the part of the mandible that comes up into your face. And you can see I've actually used putty to put the two pieces together, but it's chopped completely in half. No stone tool can do that. That is a metal weapon injury. And again, these people didn't have metal weapons. It's a bit of a mystery. So on top of that, on his cranium and mandible, he had 8 projectile wounds on his body, 8 arrowhead wounds, which is incredible because he probably had more that we couldn't see, 8 that we could see. So from behind, we've got them 2 on the back and 1 on the scapula, which is the shoulder blade, and here they are. There it is. You can see how hard it is to see those sneaky little arrowheads, even when you look at the bones in 3D in person. Sometimes you have to look at them a few times before you see them because the stone is essentially the same color as the bone, and it's really tricky. So there's those 3 on the back. Most of them are on the left side, by the way. A couple of rib injuries. 1 on the head of the humerus, which is up here at the shoulder joint. That's unique, and you can actually still see the chip of stone still in there. It's black. And then the last 2, and this is really interesting, 1 on the left pubic bone again, so right at the front of the pelvis. And this one here is the head of the femur, which is the thigh bone. And if you're aware of human anatomy, you know that the head of the femur is a ball sitting completely in a bony socket, So how this happened, how there's a tiny little stone projectile in a wound there, and this is the little piece of stone right here that we photographed. That's a millimeter. You can see how tiny it is that we removed it. It's very clearly the tip of a projectile, but how he got this injury on the head of his femur, which is in a bony socket, is really a bit of a mystery. The way that his body must have been contorted. I showed this to some of my colleagues and they said, it's impossible. And I said, I know it's impossible, but here it is, it happened. So 8 projectile wounds on this guy in addition to the cranial trauma. So it's pretty hard to deny that these guys, all of them died violently, or at least the vast majority of them died violently. We're still working on this, my colleague from Oxford and I. So we've separated those 2 clusters into groups, the north and the south group. We've got radiocarbon dates now for all the northern cluster groups, and using a statistical method called Bayesian analysis, which is irrelevant, they actually model to all possibly represent one event. In the north cluster, the radiocarbon dates overlap enough that they may possibly represent one event. So they may have all died on the same day or the same couple of days, which is really interesting. We're still working on that for the southern cluster, so I don't know for sure about the southern cluster. But so what we have here is the evidence I have for there being a massacre, which, by the way, is really unusual for hunters and gatherers and from this time period. A lot of intentional perimortem, which means around the time of death. Violence, at least 2 of them, I'd say even more, are overkill, where you're not just killing somebody, but you are really going to town. There's almost like a vendetta there. If you're going to shoot 8 arrows into somebody, you're going to waste those arrows. That person's already probably has already passed away. Most of the victims of the trauma are male, young males in particular, under the age of 25 or so. We've also got the fact that these 2 clusters, one of which for sure or very likely dates to one single event, they're intrusively buried into an earlier cemetery, so that's really unusual. This is not where that culture was normally burying their dead. Then you would see all kinds of people, grandmas and babies and mamas and everybody, not just mostly young men. At least 2 of those individuals, as I mentioned, have wounds on their heads and faces that are consistent with metal weapons. And we know these people didn't have that kind of weaponry. So that's really interesting for us, and we're still trying to figure that out. Who came into the area, probably from the west, and did this massacre or these massacres? There might be 2 of them. And what I was saying a little bit ago is that there wasn't an complete absence of violence during this time period, but in the rest of the population in the whole region that dates to this time period, we've got about 3% of people dying from violent trauma. Suddenly, we have 80% in this particular, these 2 clusters. So it's really, really intriguing, and we're still working on this because there's a very unusual event or 2 different events that would have happened to cause these particular weapons or these wounds anyways. So that's interesting, and I will report back more when we find out more. The second case I wanted to talk about is at another site in the Cease by Call that's located on the Yungara River, right about here. I think my little star is going to bounce up. Yep, this one. And it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest case of metastatic carcinoma, which is a kind of cancer that spreads to bone in the world. And actually this one got a little bit of media attention in December, so I don't know if you remember that, I apologize. The name of the site is hard to pronounce, Gorodishche 2, and it's burial number 3, this guy right here. You can see immediately there's a couple of interesting things just from the burial alone. This little cemetery has 3 graves. One of them eroded into the riverbank, so there was a 4th. 3 graves only, and it's located just a few kilometers from a much larger cemetery that had 60 or 70 individuals. So there's something unique about this very small cemetery. In addition, you can see that this individual was buried all curled up into a ball, whereas all of the other ones that I showed you, they were laid stretched out. So this is really unique body positioning, really unique cemetery, and some beautiful artifacts. This is a bone spoon carved out of animal bone into the shape of a winding serpent. That kind of, and it's impeccably preserved, it's beautiful. But those kind of artifacts are really unique, and they suggest something was unusual about this individual, whether in life or in death, because he was buried in this particular position, in this particular cemetery, with these very unique grave goods. He's been directly radiocarbon dated to about 4,500 years ago, so also in that later or early Bronze Age period. He had extensive, over 60 different lesions on his skeleton. This is just a diagrammatic representation. I'll show you some of those lesions in a minute. Lesions are holes in the skeleton or areas of the skeleton where there's abnormal bone growth, chunks and nodules and spicules of bone growing up where they shouldn't. And all of those, the distribution of those lesions, mostly in the center part of the body, and the appearance of those lesions suggests very strongly, and in fact, we did a really rigorous differential diagnosis and we're really confident that this guy died from cancer. Possibly lung cancer or prostate cancer, we don't know for sure, maybe something else, but definitely from a kind of cancer called metastatic carcinoma, carcinoma that then spread through the bone from the soft tissue where it started. So I'm just going to show you some of the lesions so you get a sense of what they look like. Many of them are these jagged, irregular holes, such as the ones, these 4 that you see in the cranium. When bone is subjected to any kind of insult, when there's any disease acting on any bone, not just human bone, there's only 2 ways that it can react. It can either make more bone, or it can eat away bone, or it can do a combination of those. And so that's what we're seeing here. The cancer isn't eating the bone, it's the bone's reaction to the cancer that is eating away. The little bone cells are eating away the tissue, and you can see how irregular they are. You can see that the cancer started within the bone because it spread there through the blood from wherever the primary site of the cancer was. So on the cranium, we've got 4 different holes, 4 different, we call them lytic lesions and bone destructive lesions. I've got, as I said, there were 61 of them, so I've got tons of these images. Most of the middle part of the body, so the head, the vertebrae, the ribs, the shoulders, all of them were just riddled with these lesions. Some of the lesions eating away whole portions of bone. This bone would have been about this big in real life, and most of it's gone. These are some of the vertebrae from the back. This is a rib, the highest rib, and you can see they're just, it's jagged and irregular. The bone has been eaten away by the cancer. Here's some cases where we've got all these irregular little nodules and chunks of bone forming. So not just being eaten away, but also forming around those lesions as well. These are on ribs and vertebrae in the back. Here is the pelvis, the left hip bone. Sorry, I was pointing to my right, but that's the left. And you can see these really large holes in the bone and chunks of bone growing up. And again, that's from the carcinoma. On the other side, you've got similar lesions. Here is the shoulder on the right side, the clavicle, that's the collarbone on the right side, and irregular and jagged those lesions are. This is the right thigh bone and the left, and you can see that the bone is completely destroyed. This man would not have been able to walk at all. There was no bone left in this part of his hip, completely destroyed, but you can also see those like chunks or nodules as well. So we are very confident that this is a case of metastatic carcinoma, which is a kind of cancer that starts in the soft tissues of the body and then spreads to the bone. And in fact, metastatic carcinoma is probably the most common malignant condition or cancer that spreads to the bone. Most of the cases that do spread to bone, most of the carcinoma cases that do spread to bone are things like prostate, breast, thyroid, lung, etc. And in fact, the ones that make bone-forming lesions, instead of just eating away, are generally limited to prostate, lung, and breast cancer. I don't have breast cancer up here because this was a man, and while it's not impossible for men to get breast cancer, it's really, really unlikely, so I effectively ruled out breast cancer. But the two best candidates are lung and prostate cancer. Lung cancer because it causes those bone-forming lesions, those spicules and chunks, not just the destroying lesions, and prostate because there was much more destruction in the area of the pelvis, and that's normally what you see with prostate cancer, where most of the lesions would be in the area of the pelvis. So what we have, and we're very confident, is that we have a case of metastatic carcinoma in which it would be one of, if not the earliest case in the world. Because just besides that, I think it's interesting because 4,500 years ago, there wouldn't have been any medical treatment, perhaps a little cannabis, perhaps a little herb to make the person feel better, but not anything like we have now in terms of cancer treatment. So what we're seeing here is a natural progression of this disease, which is very difficult to see on modern populations because obviously most of us will seek modern medical attention if we're suffering from something like that, and thankfully many times we get better, we're cured. So this is interesting because you can see that natural progression. You can see what the carcinoma, how it would develop and spread throughout the body without that intervention. It also suggests that cancer is not merely a modern phenomenon, which I think most people like to say. So we know that cancer was probably much less common in the past than it is today, and in fact that's generally been accepted by most people. But it wasn't completely absent in the past. In fact, cancerous lesions have been found on dinosaurs, so it was present in the past. There's been this misnomer that it was incredibly rare because people lived natural lives. They didn't eat genetically modified foods. They didn't have pesticides. They weren't obese. They were very active, yada, yada, yada. But in fact, one of the reasons we may not see it is simply because it doesn't preserve well. In fact, there's a direct relationship between the number of human skeletons we excavate and how recent they are and how many cancerous lesions we see on them. So I think more than anything, the absence of cancer in the archaeological record is a reflection of just invisibility. So cancerous lesions, as I showed you, many of them are what we call non-specific. It's really hard to tell that it was cancer as opposed to tuberculosis or a fungal infection or post-mortem destruction from a little rodent or something. If the bones are poorly preserved, it makes it even harder to tell what the disease was. In this case, we had such impeccable preservation that it was really easy for us to be confident in the diagnosis of metastatic carcinoma. But in many cases, you just can't, you don't have that kind of preservation. You can't do chemical analyses or microscopic analysis to know for sure. So while I'm not saying that cancer was just as common in the past as it is today, I'm saying it's probably more common. It was more common than we'd like to think. Another reason people used to say that cancer is more common now is that we live longer. And it's true that while we have much fewer people dying in infancy and childhood compared to ancient times, the maximum extent of what we live probably hasn't changed that much. And there have been really neat statistical analysis done of the demographics of ancient population, where we're now starting to change our idea of how people lived short, brutish, nasty lives in the past. Certainly some of them did, but thinking that nobody lived past the age of 40 in antiquity is absolutely wrong. So we're starting to change our perceptions about how long people lived as well. Yeah.
Can you tell what the person was looking for?
Yep, I absolutely can. We know that this was a hunter-gatherer population, so because they're the same latitude essentially as Saskatoon, they would have been subsisting on game, fish, in the summers, mushrooms, berries, seeds, things like that, but very similar to what First Nations people in this part of the world. They didn't have bison, but they were hunting moose, well actually elk. They were hunting elk and roe deer and red deer and a lot of fish from the lake, and there's actually a species of seal endemic to Lake Baikal, seal, very natural food, mostly animals, game and fish. And we also know that not just from the artifacts and the context, but we can do chemical analyses on the bones themselves, looking at isotopes of nitrogen and carbon, two different elements, and it tells us very specifically what they were eating. So this was mostly a population that was very active and mobile and eating a lot of fresh game and fish.
And the person who studied the have the same food as the people in the cemetery.
Yeah, absolutely. He was eating exactly the same thing. And in fact, because of his unique burial, and I didn't see any lesions on his teeth, for example, indicating that he was malnourished as a child. There's no reason to think that this was a disadvantaged individual. If anything, I would think that this was a very well-respected individual that was unique in some way in life, maybe a shaman, maybe, I mean, who knows, but was buried in a very unique situation because of who he was in life, I would say, and not because of how he died. Clearly, his death would have been drawn out and very, very agonizing, and he would have been very in a lot of pain, etc. But I don't think that he was buried to reflect the death, more the life. So this is one of the earliest cases of cancer, metastatic carcinoma specifically, in the world, if not the oldest. There might be a couple of other cases of similar age on humans, but they're not as, the skeletons aren't as well preserved, so they're less diagnostically sound, let's say, than this one. And so that's my second case, and then I'll talk about my third case, which is, you may have seen this recently, so I apologize if you're getting a repetition, which is a much earlier site located right here in the modern city of Irkutsk, and the site is called Lokomotiv. It looks like locomotive, I know, but in Russian it's Lokomotiv, because it was first discovered in 1897, I think, when the Trans-Siberian Railway was being constructed. So locomotive, train, you get it. The problem with this site is it's located in Irkutsk, one of my favorite cities, right in the middle of the city. Part of it's in a park. So the part of the site that's in the park has actually been excavated. 101 individuals have been excavated from there. But the rest of the site is underneath the roads and buildings. And shockingly, people don't like it when you tear down their roads and buildings to look for ancient cemeteries. So we haven't completely excavated this site. There could be another 100 individuals. We don't know. But the individual I'm going to talk about today was located in the southern portion of the cemetery that's called Rezoviet, which would have been right about here. So they must have been repaving or something. And she was excavated in 1997, I think. So excavated in 97. I looked at her and discovered these twins in 2012. Here she is. She was excavated in 97, a young adult female between the ages of 20 and 25. And when my archaeological colleague excavated her, it was very clear to them that they had the remains of an adult young woman and also some remains of a fetus, a baby. But they aren't human skeletal anatomists, and so it was limited at a baby. And it wasn't until I went through the box of remains in 2012 and started to sort them out and do an inventory that I started seeing duplicates of these baby bones. So we have 2 left of a particular bone of the skull, or 2 rights. And so within a few minutes, I thought, oh my gosh, we have twins. And I was working with the male colleague at the time, and I said, I think there's twins. He said, that's not interesting. I thought, it's interesting. It's twins. So I'll show you the evidence for twins in just a moment. But before I do that, we've got radiocarbon dates, both on the mom's bones and the baby's bones, that place them pretty much at 7,700 years ago. So very, very old. This is an earlier time period, the early Neolithic. They also were subsisting largely on game and fish and things like that. So wild game, these were hunters and gatherers, not agriculturalists. So this is my evidence for twins, and this is probably boring to you, but it's really important to establish that indeed there were 2 babies. So this bone is actually in most of you here, except for the very young people. This is just one bone in an adult, but in a child, an infant, it's 4 different bones. And you can see that this is baby 1 and this is baby 2, and in black I've indicated which bones or portions are there. This, incidentally, is the foramen magnum, which is the big hole at the base of your cranium where your spinal cord comes through. So that bone is called the occipital bone, and that's where those little bones are. So we have the duplication of the bones are all bones from the base of the cranium, because they're relatively dense and they're very diagnostic, as opposed to the bones from the skull or like in the top of the cranium or the ribs, where it's hard to tell exactly which one it is, especially if it's fragmented. These are quite dense, and immediately I knew what we had. So we've got 2 different bones here duplicated, and we've got a couple more. These are called the petrous portions of the temporal bone, and this is actually where your middle ear and your inner ear are located. So your eardrum, the little tiny bones in your ear, and the cochlear little tubes are all in this part of the bone. And again, which is sort of at the base of the cranium again, you stick your Q-tip in too far, you will hurt yourself, so don't do that. But again, you can see we've got 2 from one baby and 1 from the other baby. So again, duplicates. And finally, this is the least interesting of all. It's a little tiny bone called postsphenoid. And again, we've got 2 of them. This is just 2 different views, 1 from the top and 1 from the bottom. So total of 4 bones, or 5 with it, where we have duplicates of the same bone and therefore twins. I know they were twins because, or I know the age of the twins because on those little bones I was able to take measurements, and there are standard charts based on infant remains of known age, and they were all aged within a few weeks, so between 36 and 40 weeks gestation, which means that those babies were at or very near term, which means mommy was able to carry them both to term. So she had a relative, and they were, relatively good size, so she had a good pregnancy. One of the babies was a little bit larger than the second baby. That's normal for twins. In fact, anything less than 18% at birth weight is perfectly normal. If any of you know or have twins, you probably know they're never exactly the same size, even if they're identical sometimes. So that was normal. By the positioning of the remains, and I'm going to go back here really quickly to show you, all of the cranial remains, both babies' heads, were down low. In between mom's thighs, we have what we call the postcranial remains. Those are the remains of the body. And then up here, not in the circle, but these other little ones are all body remains as well. So that tells me that first baby came breech. We've got head here, body here. Second baby was probably vertex, so head down position, head here, body up here. So we know we have twins. We know that that probably that first baby who came breech and the body was between the mother's thighs, probably that was because of birth, not because of something that's called post-mortem fetal exclusion, which is really disgusting, and that's all I'll say. But it happens during decomposition if a preterm vertex head down presenting fetus sometimes can actually be ejected from the mother's body. That's probably not the case because we have full-term fetuses, and that first one was breech. And so that suggests that, in fact, the labor was obstructed. You would never bury your loved one with a partially birthed baby in her body. So they could not remove that baby, and they buried her that way, and that tells me almost surely that it was an obstructed labor, and she couldn't get the baby out. Which today, we have medical marvels like cesarean sections, and that mom and the babies could have been saved. But 7,700 years ago, it was just a death sentence, but nothing that anybody could have done, unfortunately. So some of the complications that can arise, especially when you have twins and the first is breech and the second one is vertex, head down, is that they can get locked chin on chin. This is really rare, by the way, but when it happens, even considered high risk even today, because that baby's head is going to be larger than the rest of the body. And so it's very easy for the baby to get trapped. And so we don't know exactly what the mechanism behind that obstructed labor was, whether those babies got locked chin on chin or what have you, but that first baby was stuck, and that was the end of the story. So the babies would have died very quickly from asphyxia, and the mother eventually from hemorrhaging or maybe infection or just exhaustion. You can only labor for so long before that did. So this kind of thing in the archaeological record is quite uncommon. In fact, we know that in antiquity, in fact, even a few hundred years ago, 15%, as many as 15% of women of childbearing age died during childbirth. Thank goodness that's not the case anymore, but it was in antiquity, and we've only got a handful of cases where we can see that archaeologically, where we can see a mother and her fetus. And there's lots of reasons for that. One is that both of them have to die together, obviously, with the baby still in the mother's body for it to be archaeologically visible. If the baby's out and dies or what have you, we won't see it. Another is that those baby remains are so tiny, they often don't preserve. So even if the mother was buried with her fetus in utero, the chances of that being observed are really low. And then there's other less common cases where, perhaps there are cultural reasons to remove the babies, or perhaps during decomposition, or so on. But the truth is that within the last, say, 30 years, there have been maybe 20 cases documented in the archaeological literature of women dying in childbirth, but we know that 15% of women probably did die in childbirth. So at 7,700 years ago, this is probably the oldest case documented in the world. There's one other case from Sweden that's about the same age. So I'll say one of two cases of women dying in childbirth. The twins are a separate issue though, because human twins are virtually impossible to prove archaeologically. After twins are born, they're just like siblings, aren't they? Even if, unless they're conjoined or something very, very unusual, they're just like siblings. So you would never be able to see them archaeologically after they're born. And so the number of times where you have two babies in the same mother's body are virtually zero. In fact, there have been twins documented in the archaeological record. This is a really interesting case that was in the journal Nature a few years ago. But what we have here is two babies of similar age buried together. It's pretty strong circumstantial evidence for twins, but it's not definitive, because you could probably all think of a number of reasons of why two babies who aren't twins, and may not even be siblings or cousins, why they could be buried together. So this is circumstantial evidence, possible twins or probable twins. In this case, with them both in the same mother's bodies, they're absolutely twins. You can't deny it when they're in the same mother's body. And there's only one other case in the world that's ever been documented in the literature from South Dakota, and that's within the last 400 years. So at 7,700 years old, these twins are the oldest confirmed set in the world, which is not to say that they're the first twins ever born. Goodness, no. They're just the oldest ones that we have evidence of. Certainly, as long as there have been humans or hominids, there have been occasionally twins. Probably not many of them survived, but this is the oldest set that we have documented. So now that I've depressed you all, while bioarchaeology, that is what I do, the study of human remains from archaeological sites, can tell us all kinds of things about the lives of people in the past, we can almost never know how they died. And we can almost never look into very specific, intimate moments of their lives. And these cases, as sad and tragic and awful as they all are, allow us for a few minutes or a few hours or even a few days to understand the moments of somebody's life. Somebody whose name we don't know, but somebody who we know a lot about. A lot of very private, intimate information about these people's lives now, even though we don't know who they are or what their names are. And I think this helps to humanize the past. Instead of thinking of past cultures and past groups as homogenous blobs of people who made this kind of arrowhead or this kind of pot, to look at them as actual people who actually lived and felt and dreamed just like us. And unfortunately, we're looking at a very terrible moment of their lives, but I think we can relate to them now. So this is not easy research for me, but I feel like I can connect better with people in the past when I can look at specific individuals sometimes and not just group them all together. So what does this have to do with human evolution? As I said at the beginning, human evolution has not stopped just because we're anatomically modern. And these are anatomically modern humans, just like you and me in every respect except for their culture. And the Holocene, the last 10,000 years when these people lived, is just as relevant, and some would argue more so in terms of human evolution. There have been a lot of remarkable, even small-scale changes in humans in the last 10,000 years since the advent of agriculture, for example. So it's not that this is completely irrelevant for a Darwin Day talk, but it's also that I thought it might be kind of needed and you might appreciate it. So I think I'll stop there because I've probably talked entirely too long, and I'm happy to take questions or comments from anybody. That's it.